Welcome back to our web development podcast where we help aspiring developers get jobs and junior developers grow. In this one, we're going to be focused on answering the question, are coding interviews actually broken? See a lot of LinkedIn posts, a lot of Reddit posts. I see it everywhere. Everyone thinks that coding interviews are broken. Some people even think hiring managers have no idea what they're doing with hiring, right? So we're going to dive into that. I invited on essentially two people that have hired countless number of software engineers, have trained and helped people through the software engineering interview process, quite a bit, extensive knowledge. Scott is a little bit more, his experience is really based in a lot of experience with startups, while Daniel is more focused on FAANG level companies. So we have two different perspectives from two sides of software engineering, and we're going to get a feel for what they think about it. But let's go ahead and start with our intros. Scott, would you like to introduce yourself?
Yeah, Scott Ferguson. As you said, I spent about the first 10 years of my career going through various startups, smaller companies. About 4 years ago, transitioned to Numerator, which is private equity in a little bit of a different environment, but a lot of hiring over the years, worked with a lot of engineers, been through a few interviews.
Sounds good. How about you, Daniel?
Yeah, so I've been an engineer and engineering manager. I was at Microsoft for about 11 years and then Facebook for almost 9. Now I work at a small company called Formation, where I actually focus on teaching software engineers and aspiring software engineers, both helping them prepare for interviews, but also setting them up for success once they're on the job. While I was at both Microsoft and Facebook, I did thousands of interviews. I spent a lot of time at Facebook actually helping refine their software engineering interview process. So I've thought about interviewing a lot.
And I know you have opinions, so looking forward to it. So I want to start out with this, right? I'm going to start out, I have certain opinions and I want to hold those opinions. I want to hear what you guys have to say, but I want to start out with kind of just some very common opinions around the coding process. And, feel free, if either of you have a question, you want to ask each other questions, that's fine. We can dive into it a little bit, but let's start with this. Data structures and algorithm coding challenges don't relate to the job. There's no reason to have them in the interviews. They don't give the hiring manager much information to go off of. A lot of people, and I think it really is based around the interviews, and the challenges aren't going to relate to the challenges that you're going to face on the job. So why in the world would hiring managers ever give those types of interviews?
I don't want Daniel to go first.
Okay, that's fine. I'll go first. In my mind, it all depends on how you use that question and what your rubric is for how you are evaluating the answer. So if your rubric is, can they get this difficult, tree manipulation question? Well, that's a really bad rubric. But if your rubric is much more detailed and focused around somebody's ability to approach a problem and the way they break it down, the way they understand it, the way they then start to break it down and write different pieces of code. If your rubric is involving their ability to stay organized while they work on a problem, if it's involving their coding fluency that they demonstrate, then you can actually learn a lot that does directly apply to the job, even if the question is not something you would code on the job. So if the rubric is just, do they get the question right? You're not actually learning that much because they may have memorized that question. They may have seen it before. And it doesn't apply to the job. But if you were really looking carefully at the individual skills involved in answering these questions, they can actually be very, very useful. But that takes a lot of effort on the part of both the company to design the rubric and the interviewer themselves to evaluate the rubric. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does.
I agree with that wholeheartedly. You can almost make the same claim about any coding challenge, right? When yes. Don, you and I did that episode a while ago, and I did my Secret Santa. Nobody's going to come to Numerator and program Secret Santa. Doesn't make any sense. I've always liked the data structures questions on the lighter side. I've never asked if I do, build trees or anything that advanced, but you stick with some of the basics, and actually they do apply to the job, right? How often in normal software development do you use a queue? It's kind of a common one. It came a couple of times in my day to day. And so incorporating that in a way where I like the questions where, to your point, Daniel, like it gives me insight into how you're thinking through things. And so questions that I've used over the years almost always have one hook in it where I know it's going to be a little bit harder. I know that there's going to be a little more of a struggle. Well, I know that there's going to be this bug that crops up because it's really easy to gloss over. But how do you think through that? Like, what is your method of debugging?
Yeah.
It's giving us more context, more information about just how you work. And that's really what we're after.
Yeah, that's right. I would add one thing that I agree with all of that, Scott, is that I tend to ask questions that are not super hard to solve, to understand conceptually.
Yeah.
Right? Because I don't want, if that's the hardest part of the question, then it really is more of a puzzle than an engineering challenge. I really like what Scott just said about there being some trick or common pitfall, common bug that comes up. Because, seeing them work through that's the kind of thing we do every day on the job as an engineer. But that needs to be somewhere later on in the problem, right? I want to see them get there. I want to see all the steps that have led up to that. And then do they fall into the pitfall? If they do, how do they work through it? How do they identify the issue? How do they get out of it? This is all really, really useful information that's directly applied to the job.
I like that. So the focus should be more on discovering the process of that individual actually solving the problem. And, Daniel, in other episodes, you've even talked about like communication with the interviewer. How much time do they invest in actually understanding the problem initially, or do they just dive into it, right? So it's focus on the process. So there are companies that are like, you don't pass this challenge, we're not going to talk to you, right? And maybe we should challenge those kind of interview processes, and the rubric is what you said. Maybe those are the types of things where a lot of this frustration really is warranted. I love the idea of really focusing on the person's process and going through the entire thing. You can learn a lot more than them just solving the problem. But
yeah, did they solve the problem or not?
Exactly, whether they did or not.
Yeah.
But the argument that's going to be made for that is, well, I do have a process, and I do think I probably critically think about things enough and even start off trying to understand the problem enough, but that all goes away when I'm on the spot. I'm nervous. Everyone else is nervous. And I'm actually going to share my story. When I interviewed at Twitch, it was my dream company, wanted to work there. I was using React for a while. I knew nothing about React in that interview. Everything went blank, right? I was just nervous, and that is my fault, 100%. That's what I truly believe, and that's a confidence issue I had to continue to work on. But this is a very common problem. You guys have probably seen this in your interviews. So when you do these coding type challenges, they seem to bring on more anxiety and more blockers, mental blockers. So are these coding challenges actually exposing that process and showing you how people are tackling that problem?
I think I mentioned it to you before. There is a certain acceptable loss no interview process is perfect. Some people are going to get nervous and fold under pressure. And for us as the interviewers, we are using a lot of our time to try and, close these roles that we have open because there's things that we're trying to get done. And so, candidate experience is one of the highest priority things in my mind always when going through the interview process. And you try to make it as, friendly, as inviting to them as possible. And sometimes it works and sometimes it doesn't, right? And you'll try to coach the person through the problem, or, you'll just strike up a conversation with them or whatever it might be.
Icebreakers.
Yeah.
Yeah. Really important sometimes.
At the end of the day, people are going to slip through the cracks though. And it never is perfect, but what we are trying to do and what we are tasked with is in a finite amount of time. And depending on the company that you're interviewing with, that amount of time is going to obviously grow or shrink. But in that finite amount of time, we need to understand as much as possible about your capabilities as an engineer.
Yeah.
And so that kind of, that constrains our ability to give you another interview, for example, right? And give you another chance or extend the amount of time that we're doing that interview.
Yeah. A couple of things I would add to that is that, number one, that pressure actually is realistic. And seeing somebody perform under some amount of pressure is important. Like, how many times in my career has some important bug or customer issue come up where there was a real deadline or real like harm being done in some way, and we had to work through it productively and quickly? There's real pressure. One of the things I've seen countless times in interviews when things kind of go south is that when pressure is applied, there's a time limit. And, just like Scott said, candidate experience is like, well, that's a whole other topic we could talk about, but I'm also super, super passionate about that. I want it to be an inviting environment, but there is that time limit and the candidate wants the job, right? So there is this natural pressure, but I see people time and time again let their process break down in the face of that pressure. One of the biggest mistakes I see is people rush to writing code before they thoroughly understand the problem or thoroughly understand the idea of the algorithm before they start to write code. If you don't understand the algorithm before you write code, you are vastly more likely to write code that's wrong. And I'm not even going to say a bug at this point, because like a bug is sort of implies that it's a little bit accidental, but this isn't an accident anymore because you didn't have an idea going in, right? Because you didn't take the time to crystallize the idea in your mind in order to then think about the next step of how do you translate that idea into code. So like one of the biggest pieces of advice I give people is to not lose sight of your process in the face of a deadline or some pressure. That's, it's probably the number one mistake I see in interviews, or the number one source of mistakes in interviews.
There's a extended portion of our interview process where a candidate has several hours to work on something. Mm-hmm. And one of the things that I always do, because I've seen candidates, and this wasn't their fault, they didn't have the right guardrails going in, but they spent a lot of time working on parts of it that just weren't valuable, wasn't getting really to what we were after. And so I have like 3 or 4 bullets that when I go and introduce them to them, like, here's what we're looking for. We want to talk about this. This is the important thing. Do not focus on this. Like, this is it, as much as you need to do, because if that's the way that, you're going to feel comfortable with your debugging and your writing, cool. It does not need to be perfect. Don't focus on that. You got to harp on those points. And it's one more of going back to that rubric. It's one more metric there of, okay, coming back, like we had that conversation, and usually you check in with the person, midway through this whole process and see how they're doing. And if you got to, reinforce those points. Don't focus on this. Don't do this. There's a non-trivial amount of candidates who still get to the end of that, and they did exactly what I asked them not to do. And that's just one more thing of just understanding, what are you going to be like to work with? Is it going to require a lot of hand-holding? Like, are you able to take a set of requirements and work against those? Well, in this case, not. And I am positive that a lot of those cases where we see this happen, it is candidates that just are nervous. They're feeling the pressure. They're not thinking clearly. They may not have even heard what I said. But yeah.
But that happens on the job. So yeah. I think that's valid signal that we're getting as the evaluators. The other thing that I remind people of all the time is that, when you're on the job and we're colleagues, like you're at the desk next to mine, right? We ask each other questions all the time, right? And I try really hard to treat interviews the same way, right? Like, I'm part of me as the interviewer, sort of putting myself in this mindset of like, what if you were at the desk next to me? What's it going to be like to work with you, right? Do you ask good questions? Do you raise your hand when you're stuck? Because we all get stuck. I still get stuck. I mean, I don't know everything. And when that happens, what do you do? Like, that's one of the most important parts of the interview. It's not even just like, can you fluently write code, but what do you do when you get stuck? At the end of the day, engineering, we're engineers because we're building things that are new. So we don't have all the answers going in. So what do you do when you don't know the answer up front? That's actually a critical part of the interview. You're not expected to know the answers. You're expected to have a process that's successful in finding answers and producing answers. And not knowing everything up front is okay. Calling out what you don't know is great, right? Because that's now something on, like, if it was on the job, that's now something on the checklist to find out if it's something that's critical to solving the problem, right? That gives me confidence in your engineering process. Every now and again, it's something like, it's why do they not know about hash tables? That's a little bit weird. If that's the thing that's now on the list of, like, I think I need to learn about this thing, right? But at least they called it out, right? Like, that's positive signal and a little bit of a question. Why have they never used a hash table before? There might be some answer, right? But I'm learning things through this process, right? Oh man, I love seeing people get stuck in interviews, not because I'm a jerk, but because seeing them work through it and actually, like, talking through it together collaboratively, like, that's a realistic simulation of how the job works.
I was about to say, gives you something to talk about.
Yeah.
Exactly, that's right? For that.
Yeah, exactly. And that's all. Like, getting stuck isn't deal breaker. Getting stuck and being absolutely paralyzed is deal breaker. But getting stuck actually is a great opportunity for me as the interviewer to learn something about you that's, quite frankly, going to make the difference on the positive side if it goes well.
Okay. I like that. So when I have this conversation with aspiring developers, a lot of the focus is on being able to essentially live a balanced life, to ground yourself in anxious situations and deal with anxiety better. I think really focusing on having a balanced life can help and apply towards going into the interview, where, like, if I go into an interview now, if I don't know something, if I get stumped, I don't have this huge amount of anxiety that just blocks my thought process. Sometimes I'll kind of make fun of myself, or I'll do something and be like, I use this every day, but I have no idea. I actually did that in the Twitch interview. It helped a little bit, but that was a long time ago. But I feel like kind of just reminding myself that, like you said, Daniel, even just admitting when you don't know something, it might bring up another question, but that's a good start to the process of recognizing something that you need to learn more about, right? I wish people could see that process as more of a positive, collaborative, fun experience that they can actually learn from. And I think way too many people, I think you should respect the interviewer, but I think way too many people put you two on a pedestal. Like, you're this amazing, super intelligent human being. Whereas, you know more than they do, right? But you can go into that interview with this mindset of, you can learn something with you and also collaborate with you like you're another developer on the team to finally get to that resolution, that's a realistic scenario that's going to happen on the team, right? I think part of the problem is putting you guys on pedestals too much, and then people just get super anxious and nervous when you were at that spot some time ago.
I mean,
not that long ago.
Not even that, but yeah, right. Yeah, exactly.
I think it's fun. I think it can be fun.
Yeah. I mean, I sort of hope it is. Well, not sort of. I hope it's fun. I'll just put that stake in the ground. I hope it's fun, right? We do this. I hope all of us got into this because we enjoy building things and we enjoy writing code. So, what you're going to do in one of these interviews is you're going to solve a problem and write some code. And I do that because it's fun. And if you don't do that because it's fun, then maybe you should think about a different career. Even when I get stuck on something, I'm fascinated by that process. Why did I get stuck? Why did I make that mistake? If I think carefully about, where I got stuck and where I made a mistake, I'm giving myself an opportunity to learn about how I might not make that mistake or get stuck in that way next time. So whether I get stuck in an interview or it's like working on something on the job, I treat that as an opportunity and not as a failure. I hypothesis here is that I have a lot of issues. We had to do a whole other podcast about this, but it's way off topic. But I really don't like how math education is done in this country in particular, right? And I think that sets people up in a bad way for these coding interviews, even from a mental standpoint. There's so much emphasis on knowing answers, but that's actually not what the goal is. The goal is, I think I said this before, is like knowing how to find answers, right? And knowing that process to find them. And my hypothesis anyways, it just sort of goes back to this, too many people are learning too many things by rote and focusing on knowing answers rather than knowing how.
I had a friend of mine went through a boot camp up here. Don, you get a lot of boot camps, so I won't name which one. I don't know how much traffic you get that would care, but he was not an engineer by trade. And to his credit, he's done a phenomenal job of sort of leveraging that boot camp experience into more project management and is able to speak to engineers and has done incredibly well. But as an engineer, and as I was coaching him through his interview processes, he was doing exactly what you're talking about, Daniel. It was like, I kind of throw a prospective problem at him and he's thinking like, well, I'll need to use a loop and I'll need to use this variable and I'll need to use that variable. He's pulling the tools out of the toolbox, but he's not really thinking through like how to actually get from A to Z. And it was a very clear disconnect from what the job actually is, which is being able to think through the problem and solve it, as opposed to just trying to copy things that he was shown in his coursework.
Right. Yeah, I had a friend recently that went through a boot camp, and I don't even remember which one, so can't mention it. But he was studying for some interviews, and he told me one day, he's like, I have to know all these things. And I kind of looked at this list. I'm like, actually, you kind of don't. You need to know all the tools that contribute to helping you solve those things. And when I'm teaching with formation, I often use this analogy of a tool belt. Like, I want to make sure that the engineers coming out of the program have a well-stocked tool belt, and they know when to choose each tool, and they know how to apply those tools creatively. And at the end of the day, what we use on the job as software engineers, there's 20 main tools that we use all the time. And everything else is just, constructions of those tools. I'm going to nest this inside of a loop, and I'm going to, apply this pattern or that pattern. You're putting these things together in creative ways, and the ability to select those tools and then adapt them, that's huge. Knowing how to reverse a linked list, don't really care. Knowing what patterns and tools might help you get there and then be able to apply that creatively, that's huge.
I agree. And yeah, even when I talk about React, even just understanding the concept that it's just a bunch of lists inside of lists, like, when so many people have focused on the very specific intricacies of it and how data is passed and all the attributes, but they don't really recognize what the architecture looks like and how a lot of stuff is passed down. But when you do hear the phrase of it's just lists inside of lists, you can visualize that a little bit more. And I think it does help people comprehend concepts like that. So I like the idea of really just you're essentially saying focus on a lot of the foundations that you're learning, and then those foundations will expand and become more complex to create more complex features and solutions. Scott, you had mentioned that there's a finite amount of time and you're busy, and a lot of engineering managers are going to focus on some people are going to fall through the cracks, focused on avoiding false positives. And I hear that a lot. Avoid false positives as much as possible. That means some people are going to slip through the cracks. A lot of engineering managers seem to focus on that. Why is that?
by false positives, you mean we got to filter two people out, right? Well, you're going to filter two people out. You're going to filter out the people that are not qualified and that small number that are, did I get that right? Non-qualified and the qualified, right? There's a small number of qualified folks that won't make it through for whatever reason.
Those are the false positives.
Yes.
Thank you. It's been a long week.
I elaborated.
So, focus on, can you clarify the question? Like, why do we focus on which aspect of that?
Yeah. So a lot of times, so let me even give the argument. A lot of aspiring developers kind of feel like, this is probably a different argument, but like engineering managers are too strict and need to give especially more junior people more of a chance, even if they screw up in the interview. Whereas a lot of hiring managers are so booked up with time, they're okay with letting people that are qualified pass through and slip through because, but yeah, that's essentially what I'm talking. I think I'm tripping myself up, but does that answer your question?
It is Friday. I personally don't do that deliberately. But you're talking about two very different things, right? There's junior level developers. You have to interview them differently. And that's because they're not as experienced. You have to treat them differently. You have to set them to a different standard. That's just being courteous to them. And generally speaking, I always find hiring junior engineers is much harder because it is harder to filter through the noise there because there's not as much to work off of, right? They just don't have the experience, and that's fine. But that's part of the process.
And you're trying to assess potential, right? Like if I'm hiring a junior developer, I'm asking myself the question, do I imagine them getting to mid-level and senior in an appropriate amount of time? Do I think this person is coachable? Do I, not only do they have enough skills to be some level of productive, quickly, but do I think they'll get there eventually, right? Like hiring a junior developer is an investment, right? I want to believe in the person and believe in the person's career trajectory. Whereas hiring a senior person, you can ask a lot of questions. Obviously you want to see them write code and demonstrate a lot of the same skills, but you also have a body of work that you can talk to them about and evaluate. And that's a lot easier than these hypothetical, like looking forward. The advice I always give to everybody on my teams when hiring is, and I stole this from, I think it was like a Joel Spolsky thing from ages ago, but if it's not a yes, it's a no. Find something. That's definitely a Joel Spolsky thing.
Yeah, you can totally spend hours arguing with yourself over, the nuances. And in this, it always pans out. And I've always told people this. And then that one candidate comes through and they're like, this is the person, this is the right one, right? Like, and they get it. The seniors are the ones when that, like, it is extremely bright lights, like, this is the right person. With the juniors, it is a bit dimmer and it's harder to follow that guide. But in terms of, being okay with folks falling through the cracks, right? I think there's also a lot of variance there. And I'd be interested, Daniel, from your perspective, coming from the megacorp side of things. If you are interviewing at a place that is a startup, they probably don't have a dedicated recruiter. They don't have a recruiting team. They may have a headhunting team, but the overall funnel that's coming through, that top of funnel is much, much smaller than what is coming through at a larger organization. At the much smaller funnel, I'm very desperate to get those engineers, those roles hired. And so I'm going to be much more lenient in how I'm focusing on, who I'm going to hire and what the skill sets are that I'm looking for. And that's just, the machine's not quite operating as well as those larger tier companies are. And I just don't have as big of a pool to pick from, but I got to get it filled. Where I am today, private equity world, Numerator, we're definitely more of the mid-sized company. We have a massive funnel and it is huge. So I can only imagine what the Microsofts and the Facebooks of the world are dealing with. You have a way higher miss rate as soon as the funnel gets a lot bigger, because we do need to just get through the noise. And I'm talking about thousands upon thousands upon thousands of applicants. And there's the first round there that is recruiting, and they're doing that. And then the next round there comes down to the engineering managers. My engineering managers have a lot of things that they need to get done. They can't be spending 100% of their time in interviewing. They already spend a lot of their time doing it. And so for them too, it's getting to quick answers. Like, I just got to know, like, I wasn't so sure about this one, but no, I'm just going to pass the board.
And you can afford to, and you can afford to do that when your funnel is really big, because you're you're going to find the people. It's a luxury that, the companies with a large funnel have to be able to, optimize how they spend their time. And so they're going to have a higher tolerance for, these false negatives, right? People you said no to that maybe you should have let through. The opportunity cost of those false negatives is lower when your funnel is really large. Now, I don't think that's a good excuse not to have a good rubric for these interviews. But
it comes back to the hiring team at the end of the day, which I think is the first point that you made. Like you are responsible as the hiring manager to provide the good experience, provide the correct rubric for finding the right credentials that you're looking for. You still will miss at the end of the day. And it still is not fair to that certain subset of people, but you optimize for it and you try to reduce that as much as possible. And at the end of the day, I have no idea how many folks fall through the cracks that I've spoken to that, we're more than capable. But we just know that it happens. And the best we can do is just try to continue to refine that process and make sure the way I view it is, what is the caliber of the team that we've built? And that is sort of a good way to measure whether or not that rubric is well calibrated or not.
I like it. Okay, definitely. So it sounds like the size of the funnel will definitely influence that and how lenient you are to letting people fall through the cracks. That makes a lot of sense.
So I think so there's false positives and there's false negatives, right? The larger your funnel, like the bigger the company, the more tolerant you can be of false negatives. The smaller the company, the less tolerant you can really be of false positives. Because if you hire somebody and they're really not good, they're really not right for the team, the impact, like the negative impact, number one on the team and the lost opportunity cost of if you'd hired the right person is a lot bigger. So these things actually kind of go in opposite directions, like your tolerance to false positives versus your tolerance to false negatives, as company size or size of funnel changes.
That makes a lot of sense. Thanks for clarifying. What do you guys think about take-home projects? What do they tell you in comparison to like the live coding challenges?
I don't really have a strong opinion. For me, I like our process. Like I said, we do have a point where we will have candidates spend some time working on something. It is take home now because COVID. I've never seen one that was convincing enough to me that giving a candidate a week to work on this is remotely valuable. I would hope that a candidate doesn't spend that much time on it. That is a huge part of this, right? Is you're wasting their time. We're wasting our time's getting wasted here. So I have preference towards the shorter end of the longer projects, clear, concise, get to the point, go, no go decision. But candidly, I've never really weighed that very heavily. I could be convinced to go either way.
I'm also not a fan of the take-home projects. There's so many ways that they can be gamed, and it's hard for me to just have confidence in what's going on. Now, I have used them, but in a very different way than I think a lot of people use them. I think it's becoming more common to use these take-home projects as sort of an initial filter. I actually will sometimes use them at the end. And the reason for that is that, let's say you've already done 3-4 coding interviews, like you've done a full on-site. And there's a bunch of really good signal in there, but there's a couple of weird, we're not sure, maybe we didn't get the signal for whatever reason. Sometimes a take-home project that's focused on filling in our knowledge, filling in the signal can actually be useful, right? And I'm not going to give somebody a take-home project if I didn't see them write some amount of reasonable code. Right? I want to believe when I get that take-home project back that they actually did it. If I know nothing about them, then I don't know anything about the take-home project code when I get it back. But if I have some signal, I can sometimes use these things to fill in. And then kind of, again, especially for a more junior candidate where it is harder, maybe I'll give them something that's a little bit stretch, and I'll see like, well, they'll probably need to look up some stuff on Stack Overflow for this, or they'll need to like consult some documentation about something like, hey, build something with this API, build something with my company's API, right? Read this documentation and do something. That might actually add the kind of signal I need, but it's building on top of a foundation of signal that I already have from them, not like my first, like, here, try this as an initial, like, pass fail filter to get through to the rest of the interview process.
It's an interesting take, because we do it further down the process. You've already gone through screens at this point, but I want to think more on that. So what we will do is, you'll have a screen. You've spoken with a recruiter. It's more of a personal thing. You've done a technical screen with a engineering manager. We have this longer project where we'll go through that whole process, and you've now seen a lot of those signals. We then custom tailor the rest of the interview at that point, because then it's sort of like, okay, let's have some more digging conversations. What do we want to get into? What do we want to understand? Well, did they talk about this? They talk about that. I want to dive more into this. Or when they were talking about their project, I didn't really get a good vibe on that. And we'll dig in further, rather than using the code to actually do that. But it's kind of an interesting perspective to flip it. I like that.
I've never heard of that. I love the idea of using it to supplement, because when you were saying you did it at the end, I'm like, oh no, I can already see people getting frustrated. I've already done these coding challenges, done several interviews, and you want me to do another take-home project? Do you even value my time? Like, I've seen tons of threads about this and stuff like that, but you worded it in a way where like you're kind of like, there's a little bit of a gap you want to figure out, right? And maybe it's that last gap. And so maybe you give them a specific project that's going to help assess that. That, to me, that's legitimate, right? Because you could, if you're unsure, Scott, you said if it's not a yes, it's a no. Daniel, you could take that stance and be like, you know what? No take home project. I'm unsure about you. I'm going to move on to the next candidate. No. Yeah. Exactly. And so you're giving that candidate a more of an opportunity, and it's up to them to decide if that's worth their time.
That's right. Then they can always bow out. I mean, that's something else that like more candidates need to understand is like, and this sort of comes back to the nervousness thing too, right? There's a perception when you're interviewing that the interviewer has all the power in the room. And that maybe is the case if you're thinking only in that one narrow moment. But if you think a little bit bigger picture, the candidate actually has a ton of power in the room. Because at the end of the day, they either, like if I make an offer, they have to want to accept it, right? Now they have all the power. It's completely flipped, right? Or they can say no, like they don't want to continue on to whatever the next phase is, right? So it's on, us as the interviewers to make that experience really great, to make, to sell our teams, to sell the companies. At the end of the day, they have to want to continue, and they have to want the job, and they have to feel like it's worth their time. And we have to set up that environment, right? We have to set up that supportive environment. And if they don't like where things are going, they thought the question was a bad question for whatever reason. I mean, they might not know what our rubric is. They might not actually know if it's a bad question or not. But if that's their opinion and they bow out, you know what? We maybe just lost somebody good. So, they do have some power. They should potentially use it more. I actually coach people at Formation about this all the time. Like people will come to me like, I just interviewed at this company and this happened and this happened. And it was a really bad experience. What should I do? I'm like, say no. Like, this is real easy. Don't go there.
It's a pretty clear signal right there.
Yeah. Like you should be interviewing as the candidate. You should be evaluating the interviewer and the company as much as they're evaluating you. Really important.
You're 100% right. The problem I see is people do it because they're told to do it, and they don't genuinely want to know about the company or the process. And I think like it can take some time to instill the confidence that they should care about how they're going to grow at that company. They should care about the team and how they're going to be treated. And even just something else that you mentioned, it's like, in my opinion, the further you get into the interview interview, the more power you start to have. And I see so many aspiring developers that are just scared to negotiate. It's first job. I don't provide much value. I'm lucky you're hiring me. And they will not negotiate that final offer. That's a question for both of you. How do you perceive that when someone does negotiate that final offer that's fresh to the industry? How do you perceive that?
Negotiation is a tricky thing. Some people are good at it. Some people are bad at it. There's a lot of nuance there. I've had cases of that where the person just priced themselves astronomically high, and it's like you're no. Yeah. And we're closing out at that point. If they're smart about it and they know like where the right numbers are to be negotiating around, then I don't honestly think I even would think twice about it, to be completely honest. I'm not thinking about their years of experience at that point. It's just simply, there's a range that we have to work within. And any mid to large size company works this way, that there is a framework around compensation. It is on us to be correct about it. There's a framework around compensation. We're going, staying between these lines is what we've got to work with. And that's what the negotiation comes down to. As long as you're staying here, and that's the conversation we're having, and you're not on Saturn, which has happened.
Yes.
not worried about a negotiation.
Yeah. Yeah. Like the where it gets tricky is, like Scott was saying, if what they're asking for like puts them in the next level band, and the signal we have about what they're capable of doesn't support them being in that level band. And it's like, nope, we're willing to make you an offer at this level. There's wiggle room on compensation within that level band, but by the time you get all the way through the interview to an offer, we feel like we have a pretty good idea of where you will fit in and be successful in terms of how this company evaluates engineers. And we're unlikely to change to the next band at that point.
It works both ways, right? I have had, actually somewhat recently, had a candidate come in at a much lower title than I'm sitting in the interview. I'm just like, who is this person? Like, oh my God, like, whoa. And the follow-up, this is one of these ones when I'm sitting through the interview and I'm already sending Slack messages to the recruiter of get the offer letter ready. Like, this is, we're gonna keep this moving, but I'm also sending another note to the prospective manager of like, what do you think about this title? Like, that's going to put them up into the higher price point as well. So it doesn't always have to work against you.
No, it doesn't. One other thing to call out there though, is if somebody's on the border between two level bands, my advice, independent of cost to company, like whatever, is actually to start at the lower band.
Yes.
Because this is mentally really hard for people, because some people get really like tied up in these labels and levels and things. But here's what happens. If you start out too high, when that first evaluation comes around, you might get hammered a little bit, right? Because you were sort of barely squeaking into that level. And as much as this sucks, first impressions matter, right? Your first evaluation, your first review at a company, you want that to be good, right? That's going to set up trajectory. That's going to set up expectations. You change teams, your new manager is going to look at your reviews. You really want that to be good. I've seen it work out where people who start down a level actually make more in total comp over time, because they kick ass on their first review, right? And remember, bonuses and things are based on your reviews, right? And those bonus curves are generally not linear. They're quadratic or potentially exponential as you get to these higher and higher performance levels. So starting down a level, your salary might be a little bit lower. But if you were on the border and you're sort of on the upper end of that band and you do really, really well those first couple of reviews, well, number one, you're probably going to get promoted. Number two, you've set up these expectations of like, hey, this person's a rock star. Number three, now you're getting equity refreshers and bonuses on the higher end of these curves. So your total comp is different. Your total comp is higher. Your career trajectory is better. And it's just sort of like the long-term better strategy. But you have to sort of take a step back from like, oh, I got a mid-level offer instead of a senior offer. Like, oh, I really wanted that senior offer. Well, you're going to a new company. No matter how good you are, you're going to have things to learn. Set yourself up for success. Give yourself some wiggle room. Put yourself in a situation where you're going to be able to like ramp up quickly and meet and exceed those expectations if possible.
There's also far less red tape in a raise when I'm promoting you versus you just want more money.
Yes.
I will be able to give a much bigger raise for a promotion.
So that's definitely a thing. And the problem with startups is I think a lot of startups don't have a good system in place for promotions. And I think startups in general can take a little bit longer to develop kind of just that pipeline of going from junior to mid to senior and different levels within. So what people are finding, and I'm finding this as well with especially a lot of startups and mid-tier companies, it's way easier to bump up my salary if I just join a new company. So I'm going to aim for the highest salary possible. Like Daniel, I think FAANG level companies are probably more equipped to be able to do that. You're at Numerator, Scott, you're probably more equipped to be able to do that. But even think about like Analyte Health, think about like some of the previous companies that you've worked at, like smaller startups. I'm telling you, that's not a reality at most startups. That's not what I've seen when I've talked to different hiring managers. And that's why like so many people will just, first of all, I think they underestimate the value. They don't ask for enough initially. But secondly, like just 80-90% of developers that I talk to that have some experience, they truly struggle even with promotions to get the salary bumps that they can get by joining a new company.
I think that's so I'm just going to assume you're right. I don't have experience in a lot of startups, so I'm just going to take that as fact for now.
Well, actually,
let's say that's true.
Before you do, I want to hear Scott's opinion on this because he's more in the startup world, and then we can dive into that.
Oh, sure.
Well, the reason I got out of the startup world is because it's high risk, high reward, right? So think of the high risk areas of startups. And you're talking about candidates that aren't doing a lot of research into the actual company. There definitely are startups up there that have a lot of potential where you can make a lot of money and you can put yourself out there with that kind of an offer. Most are not that case. And you should not expect that they're going to have, it's just the unfortunate reality of it. They're not going to have great career ladders. They're not going to have great salary structures. The salary structure is probably all over the map if you actually got to peek into what's going on there. I wouldn't put startups on I would consider a startup as predictable in that sense.
Yeah, that's fair.
Than I would any other company. You get to the mid-sized companies, it's a lot easier to work within those parameters. You get to the bigger companies, it's a lot easier to work in those parameters because they have structure and they know what they're doing and they have money, which unfortunately not always the case in a startup.
Yeah. Okay. I'm glad I let you go first because then I can just add something simple. Which, if it's a startup, even if it's small, if it's actually on a growth trajectory, it's in the management's interest to retain good employees. So if you deserve a promotion or you deserve a raise, it's good management to see that happens. And if a company's not doing that, they're shooting themselves in the foot, and absolutely those people should go somewhere else and get that higher salary. But
I'll hire that person.
Yeah, same. Exactly.
It's literally being competitive.
Yeah, that's right. So I think that's fine on some level, right? Companies that are going to do well, like it's going to be more efficient for them to retain their great employees and support them in their growth than it will be to go back to their potentially small funnels and try to hire somebody else. So, they should leave those companies if that's not happening. And I think that's okay.
Okay, that makes a lot of sense. I think that definitely differentiates between what a larger and smaller company can simply offer, right? And so, so we talked a lot about like salary stuff. Now we're starting to branch into more like mid to senior level, how you can progress. So I want to bring it back to like entry level for the people watching this. As far as take home projects, it almost sounds like, so there is, my LinkedIn feed is 90% coding interviews are broken. Give us take home projects. Why aren't you giving us take home projects? Take home projects relate. I feel like you've kind of answered why already, right? For the take home projects.
Can I add one succinct thing there? I want to watch you do it. It's about the process. That's it.
And I mean, I've already given you the devil's advocate with that. I think, both of you had a lot of good reasoning around why you like sharing the process. Unfortunately, there are managers not like you, because I've gotten to know both of you, but there are managers not like you that it's not as much about the process, or they don't even have that strict rubric. They're looking, but I don't think they really have a strong idea of what they're looking for. I've seen this much more with startup managers that are kind of just, some are panicking, some just want someone on the team and they're just trying to do the best job they can. And maybe some people are getting pushed into leadership positions way too quickly for hiring engineers. But for the take-home projects, it's really interesting because it almost sounds like you both are against that for the most part if you can't really see the process. And I'm telling you, I know many aspiring developers, they're cheating. They're trying to cheat their way into interviews. Those take-home projects, that is one of the easiest ways to cheat. Spend 3 to 5 hours, do this take-home project. Well, actually, my one question for that is there any way that you can kind of spot that cheating? I've heard a lot of hiring managers will get them to really dive into the detail of the implementation. Walk me through your project is a very common question. Is that how you do it?
I had a recent experience where we had a candidate who was presenting, and I had to go watch my kids or something on this. So I muted my camera, muted my microphone, and I go back and walking through the house, and I'm just listening. Back in my mind, I'm like, sounds like they're reading this for the first time, like the way that they were describing it. And I get a Slack message from the manager who's on that team who was hiring this person, and he's like, does it sound like they're reading this for the first time? And I'm literally Googling. I picked a one giant if statement that was on screen that I was going to get a nice big match on if it was copied and pasted. And there it was. I got 3 examples on GitHub where this had clearly come from. And, you don't see a lot of that, but it happens.
If the company doesn't have a good rubric, and I think those coding interviews are broken, and you're all these people you're seeing complaining about this stuff on LinkedIn, don't go to a company where you think it's broken. I challenge you to go to a company that thinks really deeply about its interviews and the interview process and tell me that that's broken. Yes, there's going to be false negatives. That's humanity. That's we're never going to get away from that. But there are companies out there that think about this really, really deeply, and interviewing there will be a great experience, and you may or may not get the job. But, I challenge you to come up with a way that those well-designed interviews are broken.
Also, I'll go back to the startup point, right? You're correct, Don. Engineering managers all the time are getting promoted in startups when they're not ready for it. I was. It's just a common pattern. It's, I think, probably less common these days now that the industry has kind of matured and then settled into roles and titles, but it's certainly still a thing. But you go into the startup world, you're going to have less of that structure. You're going to have less of that thought process. When we were at Analyte together, one of the things that, I did with engineering leadership was career ladders because we didn't have anything. It just wasn't there, right? And it was a piece that was missing so that we could have those conversations and start introducing that structure. It's always going to be hit or miss in the startup world. One of the things, I think you and I have talked about this before, but one of the areas where I think, from what I've gathered of your audience and specifically the entry-level folks trying to get into the industry, is these junior level roles in some cases may be too high of a bar for where they're at. But internships are a great way to position yourself to getting a start in your career. And it's usually not the startups that are looking for interns. It's usually the bigger companies that do have the structure, have the better patterns and pathways to getting into the organization. And it's a much lower bar that is far more accepting of somebody who is fresh out of school, doesn't have a ton of experience. And you're going to come out of it with that experience, whether you convert at the end or not. You're going to do a hell of a lot better in the interviews that you go into. which comes from the confidence you earned during the internship. And then, leads to less of the nervousness, the freezing up. I completely forgot all about React type of experiences.
Mm-hmm.
I like that. I have 2 more questions. We're definitely going to use a full amount of time. You guys have 15 more minutes?
Sure.
For you, Don, I got 20.
Love it. All right. So you had mentioned, Scott, that internships are a really great way to kind of break in when you're definitely newer. I love that. The problem I've always had with it are internships are very competitive. They're hard to find. But like you said, larger companies, mid-sized companies, they're more open to that. And I think a lot of people are probably looking for internships at the wrong companies. They're looking at the wrong companies to find those internships. So definitely aim for a larger company. But there's also big push.
Quick add to that, also wrong time, because internships are often seasonal. So I don't know how many are looking in the middle of winter.
Gotcha. So summer.
Well,
Usually.
you need to be looking in like September through January, because the internships are mostly in the summer, unless it's a really big company that has enough of a support program that they can kind of run it year round, because typically these internships are targeted at university students. And of course, more and more people are not coming to software engineering through, a big university kind of program. But the reality is that these internships are typically on a somewhat of a university schedule. So the companies are hiring in the fall into early winter semesters for internships in the summer. And if you're not looking at the right companies at the right times, you're not going to get through, not because you don't meet the bar, but because they've given out all their summer internships already, or they don't have a winter internship. Like, you're ready now, you're graduating out of your boot camp now and looking for something, starting in October. Well, the companies that have fall internships, they started in September. And, so your next possible chance is maybe to get hired for a January start. And then for all kinds of reasons, they want those interns to be in cohorts, because they can sort of evaluate groups of them. It makes it easier to compare. It makes it easier to support. It actually makes a better experience too, because they can organize intern events for the whole group, rather than like, oh, we have one intern right now and we've got another one starting next month. It streamlines onboarding. Like, it makes everything more efficient. So I don't think that's going to change. And so I think Scott's point that if you're going for these things, you have to, especially if you're not in a university environment, you need to kind of set your expectations relative to those kinds of timelines and programs designed for those people.
Okay. That's really helpful. Yeah, that schedule's super helpful. I didn't even know that. So what was my original question? It was, we were talking about internships. Oh, so with a big push is a lot of these positions, a lot of these entry-level positions are labeled as entry-level. And I want to tell you why I think that is and why they're rejecting so many entry-level applicants. I want you to correct me and elaborate if you have ideas. But a lot of people hate that all these entry-level positions have so many requirements. They say like two years of experience, 3 years of experience, etc. And I think there are legitimate positions that are labeled as as entry level. And sometimes I do think that bar is too high, but I think the primary issue, people have a misconception when applying for positions. I always say that position is for the ideal candidate. You're almost never going to meet all the requirements. If it says 3-year as an entry level, you should apply, especially if it labels it as an entry level. I think there's a misconception, but I also think that each company has a different bar of what entry level means at that company. And I also think that they're maybe thinking, like for my second position, for example, it was considered junior position. I went from Analyte Health, worked there for a year. They're like, yeah, this is a junior position. I'm like, well, I have a year of experience. Like, we still see you as a junior. And it took me a while to it's almost an ego check. And it took me a while. I'm like, okay, maybe I am still a junior. And I went to that and they upped the bar quite a bit with React. We really dove into React. I'm like, oh, okay, I didn't know as much as I thought I did, right? But that was entry level for them. And that's also why I believe some of these positions can be confusing to new people coming in because the entry bar is just higher. Those are my two beliefs about it. But what do you think about that common complaint? Entry level isn't really entry level and companies aren't putting their job postings online accurately.
I think it's definitely the case that the job descriptions are always aspirational. I think that's just, and I actually think this is a bit of a problem, but it's going to be a really hard thing to fight. I actually think it's a bit of an equity issue, right? There's all kinds of research that says that, men will apply to positions aspirationally, women tend to not. Like the psychology research has been relatively consistent on that for a while. So by writing job descriptions that are so aspirational, you are potentially preventing otherwise great candidates from applying. So I do think that's a bit of a problem, but I also think it's definitely the reality that we have today. But if the position says entry level, what that means is that they're expecting to pay that person in that salary band. And so that actually means something real. That actually, behind the scenes, that means dollars. So I trust that a lot more than I trust the job description.
Okay.
I don't think I can even add anything to that. It's kind of sucks to like boil people down to just buckets of dollars. But at the end of the day, that is like a lot of where some of the decision making comes from, like especially as you get into some of like the salary conversations and things later on in your career. And you don't realize that you're getting sized up behind the scenes with, well, this person's making less than that. And, they're doing far, far more. I agree. If you're asking for entry level, you're looking for entry level. Where you price that is probably a much bigger concern than the actual specifics there. I've seen some hilarious ones too. I came across one that was like entry level. You needed 10 years of like Excel. Okay. I was doing Excel when I was 11. It didn't make any sense. So yeah, I wouldn't trust them.
Okay. Yeah. And, like you said, that actually, I do remember seeing a couple studies on that, Daniel. And there's even if we expand past just like the way women think versus men with that. And because I have heard of men are going to be applying to something a little bit more ambitious that is aspirational, where women are a little bit more conservative with that. And just even the way what they should apply to, but that expands even to different personalities as well. It's like there's some people that are just going to be really good engineers that don't have a lot of confidence. And that's the problem. A lot of aspiring developers, they don't realize it is aspirational. They should apply to those positions, right? I think there are extreme examples where okay, this is getting ridiculous. Like 10 years of what? 10 years of React? Are you sure? Right? French level.
Only 4 years old.
Right. And one place those job descriptions are really useful though, is in imagining yourself doing the things that they describe. Ignore the years experience, blah, 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 right? But what they're telling you is something about the job content. Do you, if they're expecting 10 years of Excel experience, do you want that job? That's telling you might be spending a lot of time in Excel. I personally do not want this job, right? That's giving me useful information, right? I just sort of scratch all those years experience, blah, 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 whatever out. But it is telling me this is what this team does. This is what this team values. This is what, can I imagine myself doing these things? Right.
And on that same line, there's a very honest parts about it too, right? Years of experience is really subjective because some people are just far more talented than others and some move more slowly. And it's just, that's kind of I've never actually measured a candidate up against that specifically on the, as it is in the job rec, but it tends to be why I keep them out of career ladders as well. But run for the hills if it's Excel, SharePoint,
WordPress,
Salesforce, right? These are bad things. You don't want this. But otherwise, it is also telling you a lot of the things that the team is doing. We're not going to put technologies in there that we're not using. This is a lot of helpful color and context into what should you study up on beforehand? What are some of the things you should be learning? what you should be thinking about. What are the questions you could be asking? A lot of the entry-level candidates, to your point, Don, they don't really care about the company. They're asking more about technical stack questions, but come prepared with a couple of those maybe, and use the rec to help guide that.
Yeah.
I like that. It's good advice. All right, let's move on to our last question. This is all good. It's all really good. It's a shame I'm not going to be able to release this for at least a few weeks. So let's end with advice. People constantly want to know how to prepare for coding interviews. That can mean anything. Could even mean, a project. That could mean data structures and algorithms. Maybe that even means you realize that you're eventually going to get a take-home project. I think the trickiness is everyone does it differently, but for aspiring developers that just want to know how to prepare for coding interviews coming up, what's your advice?
I've talked about this on here before, but my advice is the advice I can never give anybody who works for me, because I can't ask them to do work out of hours, but don't stop writing. Always have projects, have something that you're doing on the side, just a passion project, whatever it is, something you don't know, something you can learn with. It's all practice at the end of the day. The more you do that, the more confidence you're going to get, the more that you're connecting those wires of the tool chest that Daniel, you were talking about earlier. All those things start to make a lot more sense. And then you're going into that coding interview and you're speaking fluently. You're not freezing up because you know how to do this. That's just practice. And I feel like, from what I hear and I've learned from you over time, is it sounds like a lot of folks go to their boot camp, or they go to school and they think they have the skills, and they, get put in this place in an interview where they just don't feel equipped to do that. You have to work towards it. It is a very competitive industry, and it has gotten a lot more saturated in the last 15 years that I've been in it. It was much simpler to penetrate back then when I got involved.
Yeah, I'll second that. Practice is really key. And I know there's this perception that I hear this phrase, grinding leak code. Like, I'm going to just grind a ton of leak code for, N months or whatever to prep for these interviews. The problem with leak code is that the problems are all of a very particular style, or most of them are a very particular style. And quite frankly, leak code medium is already generally harder than the work you typically do on the job in most software engineering roles. So they're not terribly realistic, number one. And number two is, if you're just coming out of a boot camp, leak code medium is probably above your level, and spending all of your time working on those is not effective practice, right? Mastering the fundamentals is the way to build up to those things. So if you're lucky enough to get an interview at a company like Google or something where the bar is really high, you're fresh out of a boot camp and you land this interview at Google, there's this perception that Google's going to ask, leak code medium to hard level questions. That might be true, but the way to prepare for that interview is to master the fundamentals, to practice the fundamentals, to be completely fluent in the basic tools. Because, like I said earlier, the more difficult problems are generally just compositions of the easier ones, or compositions of the patterns you learned in the easy ones. So being super fluent with the fundamentals is the way that you will be more effective at tackling a novel problem that you've not seen before, that might even be a little bit harder than what you're used to. Scott and I are both musicians here, so I use this analogy all the time. Even the top performers on whatever instrument, they still practice the basics. They still practice scales. They still, whatever, or, you see baseball players on the sidelines throwing the ball back and forth at various distances. They still practice the fundamentals. So diving into leak code mediums and leak code hards is not going to be effective practice for most people.
I love it. That's good advice that a lot of people need to hear. That's even coming from someone that helps people get into FAANG level positions too, because you don't often hear that advice from someone in your position, Daniel.
Well, and that's where I see most people fail, is that they failed on, even if they conceptually understood the idea of the solution to a problem, I see them failing to code it because they weren't able to constructively put the fundamentals together.
I like it.
Deciding to just run a marathon when you haven't done any training.
Yeah.
All right, we're going to wrap up with that advice. This is good. I have no idea how this episode's going to be perceived, but I honestly think this has tons of good advice. So, if you're watching on YouTube, definitely let me know in the comments. You completely disagree, agree? Do these two hiring managers sound reasonable, or do they sound like the same hiring managers that don't know what they're doing with the hiring process? But let me know in the comments. Scott, Daniel, stick around for a couple minutes, but thanks so much for coming on.